Good morning, everyone. I'm from Boston, Massachusetts, so for anyone who finds themselves hungover this morning, believe me, I'm sympathetic. Where are we? We want to go back. So there's so much I want to cover with you this morning, and I'm really looking forward to not only sharing some of these thoughts with you, but really having an exchange and getting into some of your questions. I'm really fortunate to have kind of run around the world and applied a lot of what we developed in the first two Obama campaigns to a wide variety of challenges, and it really comes down to basically specializing in getting millions of people involved in big ideas and big projects, and that's what I do for a living, and that's what I want to cover with you this morning. I'm going to talk about culture and how a lot of this comes down to the culture that you build around your teams. We live in an age, as you just heard, that the old 20th century model of just simple persuasion is no longer enough. So I'm going to talk a lot about how creating a conversation with the customer or the client is much more important than a single standalone persuasion exercise. A relationship over a single transaction, thinking about having that customer or that client as part of your life in 3 years, in 5 years, in 10 years, etc. You heard my introducer reference, but it's very typical that a lot of people lunge at the newest tools, the latest tools, and what I think is actually the most powerful engagement campaigns combine the old and the new, and I'm going to give you some examples of that. A relentless focus on the target demographic and the individual, and that's probably the one thing that I'm going to hammer over and over and over. Constantly adapting. We created a startup culture at the beginning of the first Obama campaign, and no matter how much we grew into thousands of employees and hundreds of millions of dollars of budget, we still held on to that kind of startup mentality. And also the thread throughout a lot of this is how the leadership that created our first campaign, specifically Barack Obama, created a culture that was really able to grow and adapt and sustain, but maintain its focus and its allegiance to the earliest organizing principles that we had. It would be very easy for you to say, oh, this is going to be a nostalgic journey and he's just going to talk about stuff that happened a few years ago. The reason I show you this is because I finished a 2-year campaign with Ernst & Young that was a total blast. I'm in my 5th year of work with MIT, and I get up every day and I feel like I'm getting a free MBA from those folks. I know that every single person I work with up there is 100 times smarter than me, but I also know that I think differently, and hopefully in the course of our time together, you'll see what I mean. The city of Dublin, I helped put together their public engagement strategies around their bid to host the 2023 Rugby Cup. So really interesting projects that have taken me all over the world and into people's conference rooms and offices and lives. One of the things that I start with is the idea of thinking backwards. The 20th century approach to marketing is we have the product and it's on the loading dock and the truck is pulling up and then it's going to head off and it's going to go to the store and we need our signage at the end of the aisle. And so people start with the idea of the product. And what I want you to do, just as a thought exercise, is to start with the person, not with the product. And so when we think of the person, that relentless focus on the individual, how can we get the value of your brand into that person's life? But let's first back up. Who are these people? What is your target demographic? Is it urban youth? Is it older folks in rural areas? Is it perhaps a young couple starting a family for the first time? That's a very coveted demographic right there. And once you do that, and then you start to ask yourselves, as you work backwards to your product, where are they living their lives? Where are they getting their news? Where are they doing their shopping? How are they conducting their online lives? And as you do that, and as you work backwards from that, I think what I've found is that then by the time you back all the way up to your product, the way to move forward and the way to engage these people can be very clear and very simple in terms of how you can move forward. And so one of the things I always ask is, say 2 years from now, if you walk up to someone on the street, what is the 1 or 2 things that they want to associate with your candidate, or your cause, or your brand, or your product? And I would submit to you that if you embark on this, or at least consider some of the things I'm going to share with you, that you'll find them to be effective. I share this because when I talk about a startup mentality, it really started The campaign, when I joined it in January of 2007, was probably about from this half of the room over. And that startup is something that we held on to no matter how much we grew. Why are US presidential campaigns interesting to study as marketing exercises? Because they engage hundreds of millions of people. The urgency of a presidential campaign and the pace tends to work as an accelerant in technology. It will take the marketplace and make it generate new ideas and products that much quicker. It also is one of the only exercises that I know, and this applies probably to politics around at least the industrialized world, that spans from the most macro of national television buys for hundreds of millions of dollars, on through your online content, on through how you engage people with your online tools, all the way down to someone knocking on your door. The most elemental of human interaction, one person talking to another. So the US presidential campaigns, and I'm not limiting that to the US, but that's the one I can speak to with any authority, encompass this full spectrum of marketing tools, and that's why I think it's interesting. Presidential politics start in extremely intimate and local settings. So this is in New Hampshire, and if you went to Max's Apples on Tuesday at 10:30, not only could you pick up some apples and pumpkins, but you could spend an hour or 2 or 3 hours with Barack Obama. And this is where these things start. And the way they start is in small gatherings of 35 and 40 and 50 people. And when we talk about individuals and how we need to activate them as organizers, we're not just looking at this as 35 people in the living room of a home in Iowa. The first thing we're doing is we're asking people a simple question as they arrive, which is, how did you get the information about this event such that you decided to be here at this moment in time? It's the earliest appetite of having a data collection operation, and this is before the technology that would allow us to do this. But it's the same thing. Was it an email? Was it an SMS? Was it a phone call? Was it a neighbor knocking on your door? Because as soon as you know what made that person make that decision to be there, that obviously provides a great amount of insights into how to organize them. The second thing we're doing here, we're not looking at these individuals as a single persuasion exercise where you say, are you going to support Barack Obama? But we actually want to give them the tools to go off and become organizers themselves. It's a much different way of looking at the individual. And the main way that we did that was through our online tool, which is called mybarackobama.com, which we affectionately shortened to simply MyBo. So if you look across the top here, this is what I would call the 20th century of a web presence, which is pushing information out at people, thinking that you know everything and you just need to inform people of how much you know. This is who we are. This is what we do. This is where we're going. Read our clips, blah, blah, blah. What's different here is for the first time ever, we invited people into our website and said, here's a tool that you can come in, you fill out some basic demographic information just like you're signing up for a free email account. You can import your contacts, and then if you think we should be doing better organizing nurses, you can organize nurses. If you think we should be doing better organizing teachers, you can organize teachers through setting up your own account on mybarackobama.com. So this was a complete paradigm shift of how to look at that individual. So no longer are we just telling the individual, this is what our campaign stands for. We're inviting them in and saying, you tell us what the campaign can stand for. And if you think we should be doing something differently, come on in, and here's the tool that's going to help you do that differently. And the other thing we found, and this is when I'm going to start to go back and forth between old and new, is that by simply organizing people so that they were calling roughly their peers. So whatever you do in life, if you got a phone call from someone who does the same thing in their life, if you get two nurses on the phone together, they're going to talk for a while. They might even stay in touch for the rest of their life. They might even become friends. The same thing with seniors or veterans or anything else. And so not only did we have this groundbreaking kind of online organizing tool, but we layered onto that one of the oldest ideas that has been around in human interaction, which is that a common foundation of familiarity and shared life experiences is going to make that advocacy and that relationship much more enduring and much stronger, much more persuasive. So some of you may even remember this earliest look of Twitter. But what we're doing here is no matter what our presence was out in the earliest versions of social media, we're pushing people back to myBarackObama.com, pushing people back to signing up onto that online organizing tool. And it essentially served as our organizational kind of hub. So no matter what we did, be it our email list, be it the paid ads, be it events, anything else, it was pushing people towards that tool which we had specifically designed so that we're not looking at them just as a single persuasion exercise, but we're looking at them as someone that we can give the tools to, and they can go out and on the campaign's behalf, they can touch 50 people, 500 people, 1,000 people, 10,000 people in their own town, in their own profession, all across the country, however that individual wanted to do it. We were prepared to share that tool. Now, let's talk a little bit about communication strategy, and here we're going to go back and forth to the old and new again. Roughly once a quarter in those early states, we put together what we would call television-ready events, which is basically putting as a quarterly organizational goal for those early teams, taking those living rooms, taking those gatherings of 35 and 40 people and pushing them into gatherings of 1,000 and 2,000 and 3,000 people. And the way we measure this is not just on having these people together at this moment in time, but we look at it as the coverage the next day that we would generate in news outlets that are already in the lives of the people that we want to touch. That newspaper has landed on someone's doorstep every day of their life for the 45 years that they've been around or whatever. So the fact that we can A, get message out through a trusted outlet, and B, when we look at it solely just through a cold numbers-driven kind of ROI kind of thing, we would look at that front page of that newspaper and say, how much would that cost if we bought that as an ad? Or if we get 3 minutes of coverage on TV that night, how much would those 3 minutes be if we bought them as an ad? And you can see how this starts to build. And obviously this is, if were I working here, I would be thinking about how do I get political message out into some of these outlets as well. Now, I read a lot of biographies, and I read a biography of Walt Disney, of all things, and the creator of Disney World, etc. And he had this great thing with his design teams. When they would finish a ride or an exhibit or some kind of experience, he would stop everyone and say, is there some way that we can just plus this out? And what he meant by plus this out is there one little wrinkle of value that we can get? Is there something about the color or the signage or the sounds or something? Is there some way that we can just squeeze it, that extra little value out of this? And I applied that to myself. And I said, so here's 4,000 people in the courtyard of a Cuban social club. So we're doing the same thing as we did in the house party. We're asking these folks how they heard about the event, what got them the information such that they made the decision to be there at this moment in time. Probably, say, a third of these folks are already activated on myBarackObama.com, so we're going to activate another. And then along the back, you can't see it due to the palm trees, but there's 6 or 8 camera crews, so if you take a rough idea of 250,000 viewers per television station in Central Florida, all of a sudden our 3,000 or 4,000 people in this courtyard is not just 3,000 or 4,000 people in a courtyard, but we're actually going to touch a couple million people in one form or another, either through MyBo or through the earned media that I was just talking about. But the challenge that I put on myself was, what can we do to take advantage of 3,000 or 4,000 people at this one moment in time? So we came up with this idea that the local staff would put together a simple piece of paper with the name of 5 individuals in that area that that campaign did not have a relationship with. And we would give them a simple script along with the phone numbers for those 5 people. And right before Barack would take the stage, someone would get up and say, okay, everyone, call your 5 names, and there'd be a simple script of like 2 sentences. Hey, my name's Roger Fisk. I'm down here at this Obama for America rally. I really hope you'll consider getting involved. Soft sell. And then we would ask people to SMS or text 5 people in their phones. The point of this is that in 10 minutes, we touch 50,000 people, 25,000 of them for the first time ever, and then 25,000 of those contacts were contacts based on people that were already in the lives of our attendees at this event. So then when you layer this on top of the earned media, and you layer this on top of activating people on myBarackObama.com, and then you layer on top the fact that we're going to touch 50,000 people in 10 minutes, you start to see that this is not just a simple question of gathering a bunch of people at one moment in time, but constantly challenging ourselves of how can we get as much value as possible, as much kind of branding value out of this moment in time, as well as how can, each step of the way where people are activating on MyBo, and they're personalizing their interaction with the campaign. And that is so critical. Mrs. Obama hit the road, and so you can see that familiar looking individual lurking over her shoulder. So you can take everything that I just talked about, the 35 people in the living room, the 3,000 or 4,000 people in the courtyard, and the volunteers asking people how they got the information, all that stuff, and just start to scale it up is basically why I share that. Now, here's an interesting stat. The most powerful political force in American presidential politics is a 40-year-old home-owning mother of 2. That's who decides American presidential elections. So one of the other things when we think of old tools and new tools is thinking through who can we activate that has a relationship, a foundation of trust and communication with our target demographic. And when we think of it through the lens, if we work backwards from that 40-year-old home-owning mother of 2, it was very obvious for us who we needed to reach out, and Oprah was kind enough to say yes. That is an old version. Staying with this startup mentality that we started with, you could either think that we had to buy ad space on video games because we were forced to, because we were starting with so little and we had such an uphill climb in the first campaign, or you can think that we bought ads on video games with that idea of that relentless focus on the individual, with that idea of looking at, in this case, young voters, and where are they living their lives, where are they spending their time online, and then going and building culturally appropriate tools to reach out to that target demographic. So going back and forth between the old and the new, using a trusted surrogate for that key demographic of 40-year-old women, and then also being agile enough and creative enough to actually buy ad space on video games, which was the first time that had ever happened. It would be very easy for us to sit here and think that we alone are the ones that can activate these individuals. Part of how I want you to think about this is also being aware when these individuals approach you and they're somewhat already activated, they're already enthusiastic, they're already interested. The reason I share this image is that almost all of the images that we used from our first campaign that became the iconic images of our campaign were from volunteers. And they were from people that sent us these images by social media. And because we valued those relationships and because we made the staffing resources available to truly listen to people as they reached out to us, we were able to, I call it breathing. Can an organization inhale and exhale? Every organization can exhale. Every organization can do that 20th century version of this is who we are, this is what we stand for, etc. Question is, can you inhale? When you really reach out to individuals and you get an online conversation going, do you have just one kid who sits in the back of the office and hits send with his headphones on? Or have you made the staffing decisions such that you can truly engage a lot of people in building those relationships, in looking at people not just as single transactions, but building that conversation with them that's going to last over time? So the fact that we were able to listen to our supporters and absorb their ideas and turn around and use them. This isn't the product of some $75,000 budget that was agreed on over a conference room table that was then shopped out for RFPs from graphic design firms. This is from an artist who made it in his apartment, and it's one of the kind of main political icons in American presidential politics in the 21st century, and it's because we listened. Another interesting thing, we were just going to come at this from another angle. Any one of these things is worth like a half an hour, but I just want to share so much with you because I get excited about this stuff and I really enjoy it, is, when I talk about that focus on that individual, that focus on that target demographic, is we started to see, as we all now know, the migration from the desktop, the online experience that I grew up with, into that mobile world. And so we knew as that startup organization that we had to keep pace with this. So we decided to take a massive email list, use the opportunity of when Barack was going to announce his running mate, and take our email world and push it into the SMS world, or what's in the United States called texting, or the text world. So that's just another example of following where people are living their lives, following how they're living their online lives, and he ended up picking Joe Biden, as many of you may know. This is 100,000 people in St. Louis, but everything that I talked about with that house party of 35 people is exactly the same thing we're doing here. It's 100,000 people. We've got this probably ringed with about 10,000 volunteers that are doing the exact same thing that I shared with that early house party. We've got about 40 or 50 camera crews to the left, and sticking with the idea of 250,000 viewers per crew. And then obviously focusing on getting these people activated on myBarackObama.com, giving them the tools to go out and activate themselves as organizers. And then the fact that this image got picked up by wire services around the world, our internal analytics told us that 500 million people around the planet saw this image in one form or another in 48 hours. So we've scaled up, obviously, since that house party. But let's talk a little bit about the second campaign. And this is another part of marketing and organizing. We knew that within the umbrella of Forward, and I just want to speed up so I can be respectful of everyone's time, that we had room for micro campaigns, meaning either constituency specific or geographic specific ways that we could emphasize particular achievements from President Obama's first term. So the auto bailout, the restructuring of General Motors, which saved that automaker, we knew could resonate in Ohio and Michigan and Wisconsin. The rapidly changing states of Nevada and Colorado and Ohio. We knew, for example, in Florida, there was 228,000 people in Florida that weren't living there during the first campaign. Big opportunity to reach out, engage people, get them involved in our online tools, et cetera. And women's issues, the suburban women back on that 40-year-old home-owning mother of two. We knew that those were all opportunities to have specific emphasis on either constituencies, demographics, regions, et cetera. That same appetite that I talked about at the beginning of those house parties now has some technology that we can use to actually turn it into a real art form. So we took consumer profiles, consumer data, layered them on top of voter history, layered it on top of how people were interacting with the campaign. What did they open? What did they not? What did they click on? What did they watch, et cetera? And use that to produce a full picture of that individual. And then that would inform us, back on this idea of thinking backwards, what's the most effective message? What's the most effective tool? Is it a YouTube clip? Is it a phone call? Knowing those things, obviously, is the key to persuasion. And we tested everything, and we tested off. To give you a sense of how obsessed we were with testing everything, we had an analytics team that ran analytics on our analytics team. If that makes sense. I'm assuming that it does to some people, but that's how obsessive. Maybe there was even a secret analytics team that ran analytics on the analytics team that ran analytics on the analytics team. I don't know. But that's just an example of. And so what does all this big data mean when we talk about this stuff? It's very easy to think of it in this kind of macro, broad way, but when we look at this through the lens of, how do we reach out to individuals and give them the tools such that they can activate and become organizers? In the 20th century, you would have gone up and down these streets and you would have gone to every house and you would have knocked on every door. And maybe they're supporters, maybe they're not, maybe they hate you, maybe they not, maybe they don't even live there anymore, maybe the house is empty, you wouldn't even know. But based on our data operation, we knew exactly the 2 houses we needed to hit on these streets. We knew, say for example, Mary had just moved there, hadn't registered to vote, and Seth is interested in environmental issues. So we have a couple volunteers knock on Mary's door, hand her a voter registration form, knock on Seth's door, some environmental information, and leave out all those other doors. So when you start to think of this through like an HR context, that liberates a ton of resources that can be going to something else instead of just like a shotgun approach, just like trying to blast that entire neighborhood with a bunch of information, just hoping that somewhere in there you're getting through to the right people. Another example is we built a targeted sharing app back on this idea of where are people living their lives. We were having a tough time getting through to young people on the phone, obviously. Because in the United States, legally, political campaigns can only call landlines. You can't call cell phones. So we knew we had to develop a tool that could take that same approach to activating individuals and adapt it to the Facebook era. So what it was an application that when you downloaded, you yourself decided to download, it would allow us, give us permissions to run analytics on your friends, and then say, you have 19 friends in Iowa, for example. And we think that the president's record on doubling the exports of our agricultural products would be good information to share with them. So we would give you, the individual, some news articles, some news clips, or some video clips or something, so that when you then reached out, should you wish to those 19 people in that target area that we have, they're not hearing from the campaign. It's not another nameless, faceless robocall, as we call them. They're hearing from someone already in their lives. They're hearing from someone they grew up with, or someone they went to law school with, or someone who lives down the street, or someone who they go to church with. It's a tremendously different way of thinking about how do you reach out and activate people. And the other thing that we found was that it was the only thing when, especially in the last couple months of the campaigns, when the television spending is at its highest, we found that this tool was one of the only things that could actually move the needle and actually get through to people and be an effective persuader in terms of getting them involved in the campaign. Another tool, back on this kind of mobile migration of people from the desktop to their phones, was we put together this quick donate tool. And basically once we had your donor information, and we would send a text out to someone, here's what it would look like when you signed up for it. And then all you do is when you respond 5 and it would be $5. You would respond 10 and it would be $10. So that's just another example of, these keeping track with where people are living their online lives, that relentless focus on the individual. This is the day before the re-election in 2012. And I mainly share this because it's me briefing the president, Bruce Springsteen, and Jay-Z. That's really the only reason why I show it. There's no app or anything involved here, but each one of those, Springsteen and Jay-Z, had been off doing events on behalf of the campaign using all the tools that I have already shared with you, just as Mrs. Obama was out there as well. So some metrics on that second campaign. 1.5 million people donated through that SMS tool, Quick Donate, and we raised $115 million through it. Our internal analytics told us that $75 million of that we would not have been able to raise had we not built that tool. The Facebook targeted sharing app was downloaded by 600,000 people, and through that, they reached out and touched 5 million people on our behalf in their own capacities as supporters of the campaign. And it's interesting to note that our margin of victory was roughly 5 million votes. And I'm not saying that we can hang our hat on that per se. And then the thing that's really interesting to me, because it reflects the fact that we held on to this startup mentality from the very beginning, 358,000 offline events organized through MyBo, which is all those 35 people in those living rooms, all the way back to that one of those earliest images that I showed. And through the tools that we developed and we matured by the end of the second campaign, almost 400,000 events were put together by individuals. And so now that I've shown you kind of all the different spokes of this wheel, you start to see how a very, very powerful way of engaging people starts to take shape. So to look forward a little bit, there's so many really interesting, exciting things going on, and I've learned so much by applying some of these things around the world that when we talk about thinking backwards and we talk about these individuals and we talk about the one or two things that you want in when they think of your product or your candidate or your cause, I should note that everything that I've shared with you is based on the idea that you're being truthful about your product and your candidate or your cause. What will happen is these tools will not work if you're going out and being insincere and inauthentic. When I talk about the intense focus on activating individuals in the target audience, I trust you get what I mean by that. Layering content onto how they live their online lives. I'm just kind of summarizing now. Crowdsource when possible. I think crowdsourcing is so important to at least the creative process. The days of a half dozen smart people sitting in a conference room and deciding a lot of these things are over. If you need a new logo, crowdsource it. If you're going to change your packaging, crowdsource it. If you're going to go into a new region, crowdsource it. And I'm going to give you examples of that. Measuring everything, obviously. Having so many people get involved in 6 and 7 and 8 online tools, and they don't really put a lot of time or energy into any of them. One of the things that I think is really important is that you do two or three things online, and you do them well, right? And then you also make sure that your Instagram presence is reinforcing your Twitter presence, and your Twitter presence is reinforcing your Facebook presence. And that you can choose like themes of like a week or a month and things like that, and make sure that they're all harmonized and that they're all speaking roughly the same language. Where should we go? We'll just go to the next one. Some very interesting basic rules that I've learned is to demonstrate exactly why this product or this idea is valuable to your target demographic. Not just have a slick spokesperson there saying this is relevant to your life, but showing it. Is it lending? Is it helping that new young couple who's about to start their family get their first home? Like, what is the value, and how can we show it? How can we demonstrate it and explain it too? An interesting thing is building social good into social media campaigns, having little ways that people can click on and make small donations to hurricane relief things or something that's current in the news helps things very much resonate. And it also positions you as not just a product, but as an opinion leader and as someone that can rally thousands, if not millions of people behind important campaigns. You are not your best spokesperson is another very, very interesting thing. It gets to the same idea of the crowdsourcing. Having your target demographic hear from people that look and sound and live like them will make that message resonate much, much more. And I'm going to give you some examples when we talk about millennials. Obviously, if you're not designing your online presence through the lens of going mobile, then it's a waste of time. Video is so key, and also low tech. One of the first things I tackled when I started working with MIT is we would have some, like for example, yesterday was Pi Day, 314. And there's a one-day giving challenge that MIT does based on that. And we started this a couple years ago, and we needed to produce a small video to kind of kick the whole thing off. And they said, we'll make a budget, we'll get $100,000, and we'll talk to our film company, and blah, blah, blah. I said, no, we're gonna do it on my phone, we're gonna do it right after this meeting, and it's gonna cost nothing. That's how I try to get people to think about this stuff. And in terms of changing how leadership thinks of these things, getting them to actually trust the more low-tech, the less slick, the less professional product is, in many ways, one of the biggest challenges. Encouraging videos from customers to come in and talk about your product is so key, and I'll give you some examples. A furniture company, in their Instagram account, invited young people to start posting pictures of their product once they got it back to their apartment. So were you to visit their online presence in Instagram, you wouldn't see just professionally done photographs with perfect lighting. You'd see a couch in someone's living room with the cat on it and a newspaper thrown onto it. A much different way of thinking about getting through to these people, and it works. The potato chip company called Lay's crowdsourced ideas for a new flavor. One of my favorites is the PGA now in big golf tournaments crowdsources pin locations, asking viewers, where would you like to see some of these pin locations, and seeing the online engagement go up, the viewership goes up, the ad revenue goes up, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You see how this can start to build on itself. And these are the examples. I mean, look at this. This is not professional photography right here, right? So all the way back to the beginning, having that agile discipline culture is so key. Thinking about that conversation, making the staffing and the HR decisions such that if you're going to go out and you're going to try to engage people online, the worst thing you can possibly do is engage them and get people talking about an idea, and then there's no response from you. Or it's a canned response. Thank you. And so you see the themes that I've touched on through these other things. Old and new, I think, beats new every time. Creativity and discipline, maintaining, true to those organizational values through technological change in the United States, through social change, et cetera, constantly adapting, and how leadership is so key to creating that culture. And that is how individuals can be activated and become organizers. I have so much more to share, but I really want to hear from all of you So thank you so much for your time. Thank you for having me. And I would love to stay in touch. This is my firm, this is my email address, and I think we're going to take some questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. That was fascinating to say the very least. I'm happy to report that you have a very, very engaged audience. We have dozens of questions.
Great.
My first question to you is, have you watched House of Cards?
Is this because I look like Kevin Spacey?
A little bit, yeah.
That used to be a lot more fun. But yes, I have seen it.
How close is that to reality?
You know, it's like a lot of, I mean, if you took elements of The West Wing and you took elements of House of Cards and
a little bit of Veep, maybe?
A little bit of Veep. Veep gets the staff dynamic really good. And Veep also gets a kid that I hired on the first campaign, actually, as a writer for that show. But Veep gets like how the news of the day changes the office dynamic and what people talk about and things like that really well. So all three of those are kind of instructive, keeping in mind that they're all entertainment.
Okay. First question from Sahil, who works for Viacom 18. He says it was great to understand the nuance of strategy and tools that you applied to Barack Obama's election campaign. But he says, won't the strategy largely remain the same for the next election and for the next candidate? Essentially the same tools, the same targeting. Won't all your rivals be doing the same thing?
No. First off, we knew going into 2012 that we couldn't run it like we did in 07 and 08. That was driven by technology and a whole bunch of other things. To give you some examples, the Trump campaign had virtually none of what I've showed you. Hillary did a lot of the same social media. Bernie had kind of an online portal, but it wasn't as comprehensive as ours was. But it was a place where you could go and you could aggregate your social media and things like that. So just even looking at 2016, there's a lot of people that didn't embrace kind of that full spectrum online organizing tool. So I think it's safe to say that in the next campaign, other folks won't as well. But if it's key to their organizing philosophy, I think looking at that has to be something that they do when they start.
Would you stick your neck out and tell us what Hillary did wrong?
Well, one of the things that when I talk about these things having to be, it's fine, thank you. I think in her situation, she pivoted so many times. You know, she went from change to experience, and then, and this is no joke, I think at one point they were playing with something like experienced change or something like that, which, and Mitt Romney went through this too, the gentleman that we beat in 2012. When you pivot so many times and you react so many times, soon enough, after you've pivoted 3, 4, 5 times, you don't even know what you're selling anymore. It's just like a word salad that kind of comes out. So I don't think she ever started her campaigns, plural, with a simple idea, with a simple reflection on exactly who she is and why she wanted to be involved in that, because we did that. We knew exactly who we were, we knew exactly who Barack was, exactly what we wanted to go out there and say, and then once you build all your online tools, I talked briefly about that authenticity, then all of a sudden you could look at an email from 2007 to a clip of an event in 2014 to his farewell address in 2017, and there's an actual cohesive narrative arc, right? Because we never changed who we were. We weren't constantly pivoting and thinking, who do we need to become more popular? So that, I think, is one of her main
But then how do you balance
shortcomings.
sticking to one message versus being nimble and reacting to changing circumstance? Do you still stick to the message? Do you acknowledge that a circumstance has changed in the real world?
It's really interesting. One of the things that, I talked about Veep and how, you know, the news cycle drives a lot of the staff conversations. A lot of times something happens and the first reaction from people is, we've got to react. We've got to put out a statement. And the first thing is, well, hold on. Do you really need to react? Because what you're doing as soon as you react, you're taking maybe a 1-day story and you're going to make it a 3-day story. And can you justify those extra 2 days of that being in the news? To what? So that you could have the illusion that you tried to control this? Like what really is the value of responding? And then the second thing is if you buy into the idea that you need to respond to everything, or at least respond daily to the daily news cycle, you're going to look over your shoulder and a whole quarter is going to be gone, when you haven't been focused on proactively getting out your strategic message. That's what people need to be focused on, saying exactly who you are and what you want to do, no matter what the news cycle is, and then having a high bar for reacting to things in the news cycle, I think.
So a person by the anonymous name of DB asks, if Obama were to fight elections in 2020 and hired you as campaign manager, and to fight, and his words, not mine, against the misinformation campaign that Trump runs, would you do things differently in 2020 if Obama were to run against Trump?
First off, he would have to check with Mrs. Fisk before I do another presidential campaign.
All right.
My real boss. But no, maintaining that startup mentality, I think we would have to look, yes, factor in the history of the organization, factor in the relationships we've had, but start with a blank piece of paper and look at 2020 as just a completely new exercise. I think a lot of times what I've experienced with a lot of organizations is everyone says they want to change. Everyone says they want to do things differently. And one of the first things I do when I start to talk to a CEO is start to dig through that, because it doesn't take me long to peel away a couple layers and find out they don't really want to change, right? And so when I talk about starting with a blank piece of paper, that I think is so healthy for organizations. Forget last year, or 5 years ago, or even 2 quarters ago. Start with a blank piece of paper. What's your value proposition? What's your target demographic? What's the time frame within which you have to do this? And look at it with as fresh a set of eyes and ears as possible. And that's what I would do to 2020.
All right, Ajay Maurya from the Titan Company, which is a big watch and personal accessories company in India, asks, how is the multimedia targeting approach of conducting a presidential campaign different from any other marketing campaign? Selling watches, for instance. Why is selling a presidential candidate different?
Well, because in one sense, at least, for example, in our first campaign, you don't have to worry about that. You've got so much to worry about. It's aspirational. You're talking about what you want to do, what you will do, right? There's not a bricks and mortar product that you're selling. It's aspiration, right? And then should you be fortunate enough to be elected, then when you're running the second time, and it's a very interesting organizational challenge to then maintain that startup mentality with all the responsibilities and the weights and the burdens of being president while you're juggling this startup mentality and you have the nuclear codes, right? Like that's kind of a difficult balance right there. Anyway, let's move on to the next question because I want to try to get to as many as we can.
So Neeraj Sharma of STC International would like to put you on the spot as a campaign consultant. Do you consider the values and policy of that a candidate represents, or will you work for the highest bidder?
I think that's obvious. Does anyone, I mean, you've all made, it's very interesting, it's the limbic part of the brain, right? You've already made your mind up if I am who I say I am and if I know what I'm talking about. Does anyone honestly think I would go to the highest bidder?
Would you run a Trump campaign?
Absolutely not.
Okay, that answers the question.
Dear God, I gotta face myself when I shave every morning.
And Mrs. Fisk might have a thing or two to say about that.
Mrs. Fisk would have a lot to say about that.
Right. Here's a question that's very relevant in India. I don't know how relevant it is in the US. Okay. This is by Garima Jain of Oswal Castings. What is the role of religion and spirituality in the marketing campaign of the Democratic Party? What is their approach to religion?
That's a really interesting question. And I don't know if I can do it justice here. It's fair to say, up until the current occupant of the White House, that our opponents kind of owned, kind of religious values over Democrats. Obviously, by virtue of who this individual is, how they live their life, how they speak, how they act, etc. Our opponents, the Republicans, have completely abdicated any of this. The idea of them speaking from any position about virtue or honesty or any kind of positive character trait is now gone. Mm-hmm. So that's one side of that. The interesting thing is how do we pick that up and how do we speak about religious values in a new 21st century kind of context? I don't know where the questioner is, but I don't know the answer to that. But I do know it's an extremely interesting question. One of the things, ultimately, when you strip this all away, one of the things that I love, the thing that motivates me is, asking very fundamental questions about America. I'm fascinated by this, just as I'm sure you are by India or wherever you grew up or live. But this is one thing that now needs to be asked, given that our opponents have completely surrendered this, something that had been one of the central pillars of their brand for the last 2 generations, they have given away.
Some of the chatter that we're hearing in India, this is my question, not from the audience, is the likely candidacy of The Rock for president and Oprah Winfrey for vice president. How likely is a Rock Winfrey ticket for the next election?
A what free ticket?
The Rock for president and Oprah Winfrey.
Oh, the actor guy?
Yeah, Dwayne Johnson.
I mean, I don't know. Speaking of which, my wife loves him, by the way, so maybe that would go well with at least one constituency.
And Oprah Winfrey for Veep?
I mean, what's interesting, to try to answer this in just like a kind of toss-off kind of way, I do think, and I was chatting with maybe you before this started, but we do live in a post-party environment in the U.S., so that it's much more personality-driven than it is, the party affiliations of, kind of the post-World War II environment. So if you accept the idea that having a one-name brand, and of course with The Rock is two words, but a one-word brand, Oprah, Beto, Obama, Trump, like, he could, I mean, I guess there's room. I don't know where he's at philosophically or something, but we'll see.
This is from Lasya, who's a student. And her question is, when it comes to brands that exist without an end date, like a political campaign that officially ends when the man or the woman is elected to office, how do you get people involved and get their skin in the game, even though there's no specific end date, and that needs to be continuous engagement? How do you get people involved?
I mean, to just answer that through the Obama lens, since that's why I'm here in many ways, the president has created a foundation such that he's going to continue to work on a lot of the issues that he really cared about. And by virtue of, ultimately, presidential campaigns in the U.S. are private corporations. So all that data, all that stuff that we just talked about, is something that he and his organization owns. So as he moves forward, and he could rent this stuff out and make oodles of money. Not that he's doing that, but all that momentum, all those people, all those clicks, all those eyeballs, are still things that he can tap and leverage and motivate as he moves forward and does the work of his foundation, which he himself looks at as a continuation of his time in the White House.
All right, we have dozens of more questions, Roger, but I can't ask all of them. We are running out of time. It was a fascinating talk and a fascinating
awesome. And we've just scratched the surface. I've got so much more.
We hope to see you in India more often.
Awesome.
We do have elections coming up in India, so a lot of what you're saying we're going to be seeing in a different avatar through WhatsApp and other tools in India.
Awesome.
We're going to be seeing
Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.